Hello there, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views magazine on politics in Asia and Oceania. In the fight against the corona pandemic, China has now relaxed its strict zero-COVID measures somewhat. In Beijing, the State Council announced easing of quarantine, PCR tests, and lockdowns in a new 10-point plan. When traveling, a negative test is no longer necessary. The authorities had already issued the first, what they call optimizations to their zero-COVID measures. However, the current simplifications go far beyond that. In the case of infections without symptoms and a mild course of the disease, people can also isolate themselves at home and treat themselves. If their condition worsens, they can go to designated clinics themselves. After a week of home quarantine, 2 negative PCR tests are then necessary in order to be able to move freely again. Close contacts should isolate themselves at home for 5 days and then be able to test them free again. There should no longer be any movement restrictions in non-high-risk areas. As announced by the National Health Commission, there should be no loss of production or work. High-risk areas would also have to be defined more precisely in the future. Lockdowns should only relate to buildings, residential units, floors, or households, and should not be arbitrarily extended to districts, streets, or the entire area, as the State Council further announced. Health codes or negative PCR tests should also no longer be necessary when people travel between regions. The number and frequency of tests would also be reduced. A negative PCR test will no longer be generally necessary in the future, except for staff in primary and secondary schools, medical facilities, nursing homes, or orphanages, etc. Important state organs, large companies, and other special institutions could still act according to their own prevention plans. In the past few weeks, China has experienced a new wave of corona with the highest number of infections since the beginning of the pandemic and has reacted with tough measures. After an apartment fire that killed 10 people, protests broke out in several million metropolises across the country. Local residents had reported that the rigid measures had made the fight against the fire more difficult and that in the end killed those people. It was the largest public demonstration of discontent in China in decades. In response to the rallies, a massive police presence was mobilized on the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities to prevent the demonstrations from flaring up again. Iran says it has started building a new nuclear power plant. The head of the Iranian nuclear agency, Mohammad Eslami, said on state television on Saturday that the Karun nuclear power plant in the southwestern province of Khuzestan on the border with Iraq will have an output of 300 megawatts when it's completed. The plans for the power plant go back to the time before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Construction is expected to take 7 years and cost the equivalent of 1.4 to 1.9 billion euros. So far, Iran has only one nuclear power plant in Bushehr, which has an output of 1,000 megawatts. The construction of the power plant looks like the next step on the way out of the nuclear deal that Iran signed with the West in 2015. The deal was intended to limit Iran's nuclear program and ensure that the Iranian country does not build nuclear weapons. It was negotiated by the USA, China, Russia, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Iran. Under then US President Donald Trump, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and imposed new sanctions on Tehran. As a result, Iran gradually withdrew from its obligations under the agreement. At the Fordo nuclear plant, Iran started producing uranium enriched to 60% again. The threshold set in the nuclear agreement is 3.67%. Uranium enriched to around 90% is required to build atomic bombs. Iran is currently in the headlines mainly because of the ongoing protests against the mullah's regime. This was triggered by the death of a woman who had previously been arrested by the Vice Squad because she allegedly did not wear her headscarf in accordance with the legal requirements. According to human rights activists, China operates more than 100 offices worldwide that are used as illegal police stations. In the meantime, 102 such facilities have been discovered in 53 countries, including in Frankfurt here in Germany, said the Safeguard Defenders organization based in Spain. The Beijing government has denied earlier reports of illegal police stations overseas. According to Safeguard Defenders, however, there are 11 offices in Italy alone and 9 in Spain. In France, there should be 4, in Great Britain and the USA, 3 each. I already made videos in October that China also operates police stations on German soil. In Hesse, the authorities announced on Saturday that they were checking whether such a service office or Chinese police station even exists in Frankfurt. A spokesman for the Ministry of the Interior in Wiesbaden could not say whether there was concrete evidence of an illegal station. It's being checked, and it's being checked in detail. It's the turn of the security authorities, they said. The radical Islamic Taliban in Afghanistan have publicly executed a person for the first time since returning to power. The man convicted of murder was executed on Wednesday in Farah, the capital of the province of the same name, during a public gathering of residents that was said by Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahideen. The convict was therefore a resident of the district of Anjil in the province of Herat. In this context, the spokesman referred to the principle of retaliation permitted under Islamic law. In mid-November, Taliban leader Hibatullah Akhundzada called on the country's judges to fully implement Islamic law and its catalogue of punishments, including public executions, stoning and flogging, and the amputation of limbs in the case of thieves. Since then, several people have been publicly flogged for various offenses. However, the execution in Farah is the first to be officially announced. When the radical Islamic Taliban took power again in August last year, they initially announced that they wanted to be less harsh than during their first rule from 1996 to 2001. However, the militia is now becoming more and more radical. According to the authorities, 5 other demonstrators have been sentenced to death in connection with the system-critical protests in Iran. At least 5 demonstrators have been sentenced to death for the death of a security officer, according to Justice spokesman Masoud Setayeshi on Tuesday. The ISNA news agency reported this. Setayeshi spoke in connection with the allegations against the protesters of murder. 11 others, including 3 demonstrators under the age of 18, were sentenced to long prison terms for involvement in the so-called murder. At the same time, 1,200 demonstrators were released, Setayeshi said. The death sentences could be appealed, they said. According to human rights organizations, at least 18,000 people have been arrested during the mass protests that have been going on in Iran for more than 2 months. It is unclear how many charges have already been filed. They are usually accused by the authorities of taking part in illegal demonstrations, causing unrest, or endangering national security. In November, demonstrators were sentenced to death for the first time. Iran is one of the countries that also enforces the death penalty. According to a media report, after the Iranian Public Prosecutor's Office, another authority has spoken of stopping the activities of the Vice Squad. The operations of the morality police were stopped on the instructions of the Public Prosecutor's Office, said Ali Chanmohammadi, spokesman for the Center for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, as reported by the news portal Entekab. The morality police enforced the regulations of the Virtue Center in the past. The actions of the moral police were the trigger for the system-critical protests in the country that, as I said, have been going on for more than 2 months. In mid-September, the Islamic Moral Guardians arrested 22-year-old Mahsa Amini because a few strands of hair were said to have stuck out from under her headscarf. Amini died a few days later in the custody of the vice squad. The spokesman for the headquarters also said that the other forms of observance of the hijab, that means the Islamic dress code for women, should be decided soon. Iran's Attorney General said on Sunday that the vice police had been abolished. The statement was initially received with skepticism by many demonstrators and the critics of the political leadership. They continue to call for headscarf requirements to be abolished in the country. Women in Iran fear that the vice squad's control activities could simply be taken over by other security forces once they are disbanded. Activists also see the statements about the moral police as a diversionary tactic to calm the tense situation in the country. And there is a lot going on at the moment, as you can hear in this video as well. According to activists and eyewitnesses, protests against the country's political leadership continued. On the streets of the capital Tehran, the demonstrators shouted "Death to the dictator" and "We don't want an Islamic Republic anymore" on Tuesday. There were initially no reports of violent clashes between security forces and demonstrators on that day. North Korea fired artillery shells again near the border with neighboring South Korea on Tuesday. According to South Korea's general staff, some of around 90 missiles landed in the maritime buffer zone established in 2018 to defuse tensions. The North Korean military had already fired around 130 artillery shells on Monday. The state news agency KCNA spoke of a reaction to joint exercises by the armed forces from South Korea and the USA. The conflict on the Korean peninsula has become significantly more explosive in recent months. North Korea's military has been firing ballistic missiles at increased frequency and has also intensified its rhetoric against the Seoul government. Some experts suspect that the country, which is largely isolated internationally, could soon conduct a nuclear test again. The United States and Britain have both warned of new Iranian arms shipments to Russia. Washington immediately announced new sanctions against Moscow. In addition to ballistic missiles, Russia is also to receive drones from Iran. The energy infrastructure in Ukraine was recently attacked and severely damaged with drones of this type. Because of this damage, the Ukrainians must already be prepared for a harsh winter with many power cuts. The US government warns of increasing Iranian support for the Russian military and is therefore announcing new sanctions. We are imposing costs on the actors involved in the transfer of Iranian drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. That's what National Security Council Communications Director John Kirby said on Friday. According to the US government, the sanctions are aimed at the Russian Air and Space Forces, a state center for unmanned aviation and the Command of Military Transport Aviation. According to consistent reports, Iran had already sent drones to Russia in August, which can be used, for example, to attack military objects such as radar systems and artillery. Russia is now trying to acquire more weapons, including hundreds of ballistic missiles. In return, Russia is offering Iran an unprecedented level of military and technical assistance. That's what the British ambassador to the UN, Barbara Woodward, said in New York on Friday. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said in London that Iran is now one of Russia's biggest military supporters. Through these dirty deals, the Iranian regime sent hundreds of drones into Russia, which were used to attack Ukraine's critical infrastructure and kill civilians. Moscow, in turn, is offering military and technical support to the regime in Tehran. Japan and Australia want to cooperate even more militarily in response to China's rearmament and North Korea's missile and nuclear program. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida agreed on this on Friday in Tokyo at a meeting with Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles and Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, as the Japanese news agency Kyodo reported after the meeting. Their countries, both of which are allies of the United States, must promote efforts to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific, the Japanese said. The two Australian ministers arrived in the Japanese capital to meet their Japanese counterparts, Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi and Defense Minister Yasukatsu Hamada. Together with India, Japan and Australia and the USA form the so-called Quad Group. The four countries want to expand their engagement in the Indo-Pacific and thus defy China's military and economic expansion drive in the region. In South Korea, which is important for global supply chains, a nationwide strike by truck drivers has ended after more than 2 weeks. 62% of its members voted to end the industrial action, as the union CTSU announced on Friday. At the same time, they announced that they would continue their minimum wage campaign. The strike, that began on November 24th, was intended, among other things, to push through an extension of the minimum wage guarantee. The nationwide action was the second in less than 6 months to endanger production and fuel supplies in the world's 10th largest economy. The government had earlier forced the striking truck drivers in the cement industry to go back to work. It was the first time in the country's history that they had dictated an end to the strike. The corresponding order was necessary because construction sites across the country were in danger of running out of material. It was set as a justification. President Yoon Suk-yeol also rejected the union's request to extend the minimum wage to other types of cargo, including oil tankers, parcel delivery trucks, and car carriers. The drivers are already well paid, it was said to justify. The government announced that it would extend the current wage regulations for a further 3 years. It's game over, said driver Kang Myung-gil, who had been on strike for 2 weeks. The union fell into a trap set by the government. He was referring to the government's claim that the strike threatened to ruin the country's economy. Back in June, an 8-day strike by truck drivers delayed the movement of goods for Asia's 4th largest economy, from cars to semiconductors. This caused lost production estimated at more than $1.2 billion. Industry giants such as Hyundai Motors and steelmaker POSCO were forced to cut production due to the summer strike in June. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.